Lincoln may have carried a family secret he thought could damage everything. And when DNA finally entered the story, it didn't just answer questions. It changed which questions mattered. Around 1850, Abraham Lincoln is said to have told his law partner, William Herndon, something deeply personal. Not a political strategy, not a legal confession, a family secret. According to Herndon's later account, Lincoln believed his mother, Nancy Hanks, had been born out of wedlock. In plain terms, he believed she was illegitimate. Now, that word lands differently today than it did in Lincoln's world. In modern ears, it can sound like an old-fashioned label. In the 19th century, it could stain an entire family story. It could shape how respectability was judged, how origins were whispered about, and how ambition itself was measured. For an ordinary person, that was painful enough. For a man who would become president, it was the kind of thing people feared could be weaponized. And that is where the story usually gets told the wrong way. Because the easy version is this: Lincoln had a scandal in his family, then modern science came along and proved the rumor true. Clean, dramatic, satisfying. But that is not quite what happened. The real story is more interesting than that, because it forces us to slow down and ask a better question. Not, what makes the best headline, but what can we actually know, and what can DNA actually prove? That difference matters. Herndon is central to this mystery because he was not some distant gossip collector. He knew Lincoln closely. He worked with him. He heard things others did not. That gives his account weight. But weight is not the same as final certainty. Herndon remains an important source on Lincoln's private life. Yet historians have long debated how literally every remembered detail should be taken, especially when the claim is both intimate and explosive. So right away the story splits in two. On one side, you have Lincoln's reported belief. On the other, you have proof. And those are not the same thing. A person can believe something about their family and still be wrong. A rumor can survive for generations and still collapse under scrutiny. At the same time, a rumor can also preserve a truth that official records never fully captured. That tension is what kept this case alive for more than a century. It was never just about whether a secret existed. It was about whether the secret described reality. That is what gives this opening chapter its real force. Lincoln, or at least the Lincoln described by Herndon, was not simply passing along a nasty story. He seemed to think this was part of his own family history, something inherited, something awkward, something close enough to the bone that it stayed in the shadows rather than the public record. And once you understand the social meaning of illegitimacy in his era, you can see why. This was not trivia. This was identity. But here is where we need to be careful. Even if Lincoln believed Nancy Hanks was illegitimate, that alone does not settle who her mother was, what line she came from, or which later genealogical theory is right. Belief is evidence of what Lincoln thought. It is not by itself biological proof. And that distinction is going to matter more and more as this story unfolds, because the debate that followed was not just emotional. It became technical, historical, genealogical, eventually genetic. So before we get to the DNA, we have to pass through the part that made DNA necessary in the first place. Because for roughly 150 years, historians and family researchers kept circling the same unresolved question. If Nancy Hanks was not what later family tradition tried to make her, then who exactly was she in the record? And why did one version of her origins survive so stubbornly against another? That is where the argument hardens. And once it hardens, old documents stop being enough. Once Herndon's account entered the story, the mystery did not become clearer. It became harder. Because now historians had two problems instead of one. First, did Lincoln really believe his mother, Nancy Hanks, was illegitimate? And second, even if he did, what exactly did that mean in genealogical terms? Who was Nancy's mother, and which family line did she actually come from? Herndon's account gave the debate heat. It did not give it closure. That is where the next 150 years of argument began. The broad shape of the dispute sounds simple at first. Most researchers agreed on one key point. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was widely understood to be the daughter of Lucy Hanks Sparrow. But then the case split in two over a deeper question. Was Lucy Hanks Sparrow actually a Hanks by birth? Or was she really a Shipley woman whose identity had been folded into the Hanks story through marriage and family confusion? That difference sounds technical. It was not. Because if Lucy was a Hanks by birth, then the line Herndon described stayed largely intact. Nancy's origins remained tied to an illegitimacy story inside the Hanks family itself. But if Lucy was actually born a Shipley and only later connected to the Hanks through marriage, then the whole maternal map shifted. Same Nancy. Same era. Very different family tree. And this is exactly the kind of historical problem that can survive for generations. Not because no one cared, because too many people cared, and the records were just incomplete enough to keep both sides alive. On one side stood the version later associated with Lincoln biographer William Barton, and, in a different way, with earlier Herndon-aligned lines of thinking. In that view, Lucy Hanks Sparrow was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Anne Nancy Lee Hanks. That would make her part of the Hanks family by birth, and Nancy Hanks Lincoln would be Lucy's child born before Lucy married Henry Sparrow. Later work summarized on the Hanks DNA Project says this interpretation also treated Nancy as illegitimate and kept her inside the Hanks maternal line. On the other side stood Louis Warren's challenge. Warren did not reject the idea that Lucy Hanks Sparrow was Nancy's mother. Instead, he attacked the deeper assumption underneath it. He argued that Lucy was not a Hanks by birth at all, but one of the Shipley sisters. In his reconstruction, Lucy had supposedly been married earlier to a James Hanks before marrying Henry Sparrow. That would make her a Hanks only by marriage, not by blood. And that, in turn, would change how Nancy Hanks Lincoln's maternal ancestry should be understood. This is the point where a lot of tellings flatten the story into one side was right, one side was wrong. But in real historical work, that is rarely how these debates feel from the inside. Because both theories were trying to solve the same problem. How do you reconstruct a family when naming conventions repeat, marriages blur surnames, oral accounts conflict, and later descendants inherit not just facts but loyalties? A respectable family narrative can harden over time. So can an embarrassing one. And once those narratives settle in, every fragment of evidence starts getting pulled toward the version people already think makes sense. That is why this debate lasted so long. Not because the question was impossible, but because traditional evidence was strong enough to argue with and weak enough to resist final resolution. The Hanks Project's background makes that very clear in hindsight. It says Lincoln's mother's maternal ancestry had been debated for over 100 years, with one camp placing Lucy Hanks Sparrow as the daughter of Joseph Hanks and Anne Lee Hanks, and another claiming she was actually Lucy Shipley. The study was designed specifically to distinguish between those two accounts. In other words, the DNA test did not appear out of nowhere. It was built to answer a precise historical disagreement that documents alone had not killed. And that is the key transition in this story. Up to this point, everything rests on memory, biography, genealogy, and interpretation. Important tools, yes, but also human tools. Tools that can preserve truth, distort truth, or do both at once. So by the time we arrive in the 21st century, the question is no longer just, which historian do you believe? It becomes something much more powerful. If Nancy Hanks Lincoln has no living descendants, is there still a biological path back to her maternal line? Because once that becomes possible, the argument changes form. It is no longer just a fight over what the records seem to suggest. It becomes a test. By the time this story reaches DNA, the first surprise is not the result. It is the method. Because Abraham Lincoln's mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, has no living descendants. That means no one could simply swab a direct maternal line descendant of Nancy and compare the answer to a family rumor. The path had to be indirect, and that is exactly why mitochondrial DNA became the tool that mattered. The Hanks Project says the study was built around matrilineal descendants from women connected to the competing family lines, specifically to create a reference for Nancy Hanks Lincoln's mDNA and to distinguish between the Hanks and Shipley accounts. Mitochondrial DNA, or mDNA, is passed from mothers to their children. Sons receive it, daughters receive it, but only daughters pass it on again. So, if you want to test a maternal line from long ago, you do not need a direct descendant of the famous person at the center of the story. You need people who descend in an unbroken female line from women who should share that same maternal signature. The Hanks Project also notes that mDNA changes slowly and is especially useful for eliminating mismatches, which is an important point because this kind of test is powerful but not magical. That distinction matters here. The study did not test Lincoln's descendants in the way a dramatic hook might imply. It tested collateral matrilineal relatives from the lines that mattered to the controversy. According to the project summary, researchers collected samples from descendants of two known daughters of Joseph Hanks and Anne Lancy Lee Hanks, from descendants of two daughters of Sarah Sally Hanks, and from descendants of two daughters of Lucy Hanks through her marriage to Henry Sparrow. The project grouped these as Group A. It also collected mDNA from descendants of two Shipley sisters, Naomi Shipley Mitchell and Rachel Shipley Berry, grouped as Group B. That setup is the whole case in miniature. If the Hanks line theory was right, the maternal descendants in Group A should match each other and point back to the same underlying maternal line. If the Shipley theory was right, then the Shipley-associated descendants should align with that same maternal pattern. If they did not, then one of the major historical reconstructions would be in serious trouble. And that is exactly where the results became powerful. Group A, the descendants tied to the Hanks-associated maternal line, matched one another and were assigned to haplogroup X1c, not just broadly similar. The project says they shared the defining mutations of X1z, plus an additional core set of more specific mutations, indicating descent from the same maternal line. Group B, the descendants from the Shipley sisters, did not match that line. Their reported HVR1 and HVR2 results fell into haplogroup H instead. In plain language, the two groups did not come from the same maternal source. That is the moment where the 150-year debate changes shape, not because every question suddenly disappears, but because the center of gravity moves. The mDNA evidence strongly supports the view that Lucy Hanks Sparrow belonged to the maternal line associated with Anne Lee Hanks, not the Shipley sister line advanced in the competing theory. The Hanks Project summary says these results can be used with confidence to distinguish between the two accounts of Nancy Hanks's parentage, and that they support the conclusion that Lucy Hanks was not a sister of Rachel and Naomi Shipley. But this is also the exact point where a careful script has to resist overselling, because what the DNA did best was rule out a mismatch between the Hanks-associated line and the Shipley-associated line tested in the study. That is why the project's own background page says mtDNA is especially useful for eliminating mismatches. So the result is strong, but the strength comes from precision. It does not mean every document in the family tree is suddenly certified forever. It means the biological evidence sharply favors one maternal reconstruction over the other. And that is a more satisfying answer than hype, because now we can say something careful and meaningful at the same time. Herndon's broader world, the one in which Lincoln believed his mother was illegitimate, no longer stands alone as memory and rumor. It now sits beside genetic evidence that supports the Hanks maternal line and undercuts the Shipley alternative. Herndon's account still is not the DNA test itself, but it also no longer floats in empty air. At this point, you might think the mystery has narrowed to one sentence: the Hanks line was right, the Shipley line was wrong. Case closed. But the DNA did one more thing. It did not just separate the two family theories. It surfaced a maternal signature so unusual that the story suddenly became bigger than a question of legitimacy. At first, the DNA result seems to do one job: settle a family argument. Separate one maternal line from another. pushed the Shipley theory back, and strengthened the Hanks line. That alone would have been enough to make this a remarkable historical story. But the test did something else. It identified the maternal haplogroup connected to Nancy Hanks Lincoln's line as X1C, and that is where the mystery changes shape again. The Hanks DNA Project described X1C as a very rare haplogroup in this context and presented that identification as one of the major outcomes of the study. This is the point where many scripts would race straight into exotic conclusions. We should not, because a haplogroup is not a neat little national label. It is not a passport. It does not tell you that a historical person was from one modern place in any simple sense. What it gives you is a deep maternal lineage category, a way of tracing one branch of ancestry far back through time. So when the study surfaced X1C, the real significance was not that it delivered some cinematic identity twist. The significance was that it made Nancy Hanks Lincoln's maternal story feel older, rarer, and more globally layered than a narrow Kentucky scandal. That distinction matters because this is exactly where viewers can be tempted to overread the evidence. The MSME DNA result did not prove a hidden personal biography for Nancy Hanks. It did not rewrite Abraham Lincoln into a completely different historical figure. What it did do was show that the maternal line associated with Nancy Hanks Lincoln carried a rare signature that researchers considered noteworthy. In other words, the DNA answered one question and expanded another. That is often how good evidence works. It closes the case you asked, then opens a wider one you were not expecting. And that is a much better twist than clickbait because it is real. By this point in the video, the audience has already watched the story evolve from private confession to historical dispute to forensic test. Now it becomes something else again. A reminder that family history is never only local. Even when a story looks painfully intimate. Who was Nancy Hanks? What did Lincoln believe? Which family version survives? The genetic layer can reveal that the deeper background of that story stretches much farther than the visible drama on the surface. So the real anomaly is not just rarity, it is scale. A dispute that once sounded like a closed, almost provincial argument suddenly touches a maternal lineage with a much deeper human time span behind it. And that changes the emotional feel of the story. What began as embarrassment becomes complexity. What began as scandal becomes ancestry. What began as rumor becomes a reminder that no family story is as small as it first appears. Then comes the Washington comparison. And this is where careful narration matters most, because this is the kind of detail that sounds explosive in a title card and gets distorted in a sentence. A 2024 Family Tree DNA write-up on George Washington's paternal lineage says Washington's high-level Y DNA haplogroup, RU152, is shared with some other well-known Americans, including Abraham Lincoln. That means the two men can be placed within the same broad paternal haplogroup at a very deep time scale. But that does not mean Lincoln and Washington were discovered to be close relatives in the everyday sense. It does not mean there was some newly uncovered near-family bond between the founder of the Republic and the president who preserved the Union. And it definitely does not mean the Lincoln maternal line story was somehow confirmed by Washington's paternal DNA. These are different lines, different tests, and different claims. The Washington overlap works only as a carefully framed epilogue, a way of showing how broad haplogroups can connect famous figures at a deep ancestral level without implying a tight genealogical relationship. That is why this twist belongs late in the video. Used badly, it cheapens the story. Used well, it strengthens the theme. Because by now the audience should be trained to ask the right question. Not, wow, are they secretly family? But what kind of connection is this exactly? And once you ask it that way, the answer becomes both more modest and more interesting. It is a connection of deep lineage classification, not a dramatic rediscovered kinship, a true overlap, but a distant one, real but easy to exaggerate. And that brings us back to the core lesson of the whole video. DNA is powerful. It can cut through bad assumptions. It can expose mismatches. It can force old debates into sharper focus. It can also produce details that feel enormous until you define their actual scale. The X1C result is powerful because it directly bears on Nancy Hanks Lincoln's maternal line. The Washington overlap is interesting because it illustrates how genetic language can sound more personal than it really is, unless you slow down and explain it. So now the final question is not whether the evidence mattered. It clearly did. The final question is what kind of ending this evidence deserves. A triumphant ending would be easy. An honest ending is better. So what is the real ending to the story? Not the loud ending. Not the thumbnail ending. Not the version where one test arrives, every doubt disappears, and 150 years of argument collapse into a single dramatic sentence. The real ending is more precise than that. And because it is more precise, it is more powerful. Here's what the evidence did. It gave modern researchers a biological way to test a historical dispute that paper records had never fully resolved. It showed that the maternal line associated with Nancy Hanks Lincoln aligned with one side of the old argument and not the other. In practical terms, that means the Shipley explanation lost the biological support it would have needed, while the Hanks-associated line gained it. That is not nothing. That is a major shift, because for generations, this question lived in a frustrating middle ground. There were memories, stories, biographies, family traditions, and reconstructions. Enough material to argue forever. Not enough to end the argument cleanly. DNA changed that balance. It did not replace history. It sharpened it. And that is really the lesson here. Science did not enter this story to make it simpler. It entered to make it clearer. Those are not the same thing. A simpler ending would say Lincoln's private family scandal was fully proven and every mystery is over. A clearer ending says something more careful. Lincoln was remembered by Herndon as believing his mother was illegitimate. Historians spent more than a century fighting over how to place that claim inside the family record. The DNA evidence then strongly supported one maternal reconstruction over the competing Shipley theory. That does not certify every sentence ever written about Nancy Hanks. But it does mean the old debate is no longer standing on equal ground. One side now carries much stronger biological support. And once you say it that way, the whole story becomes more interesting. Because the payoff is not just that a rumor survived. The payoff is that a rumor, a memory, and a disputed paper trail were forced into contact with a kind of evidence they were never built to resist. That is why this case lingers in the mind. It is not only about Lincoln. It is about the strange moment when biography meets biology, and both are forced to give up a little of their certainty. Historians cannot simply dismiss inherited family talk as meaningless. Genetic evidence cannot pretend to narrate a whole human life by itself. Each side needs the other. One gives context, the other gives constraint. And right there in that tension is the truth-shaped ending this story deserves. Because what DNA can do is extraordinary. It can tell you that two supposed maternal lines do not match. It can identify a rare maternal signature. It can expose where an elegant family theory stops fitting the biology. It can even widen the frame, turning a local American family dispute into a much older ancestry story. But what DNA cannot do is speak in perfect human sentences. It cannot tell you exactly what Lincoln felt when he carried that family belief. It cannot recover every missing document. It cannot erase every uncertainty that accumulates when lives are recorded unevenly and remembered imperfectly. And maybe that is why this story works so well. Because it leaves us with something better than a cheap twist. It leaves us with proportion. Yes, the evidence moved the case. Yes, the DNA result mattered. Yes, the old argument was altered in a serious way. But the deepest satisfaction comes from understanding the scale of that victory correctly. Not total proof. Not total mystery. Something in between. A narrow truth. And for a story that lived in the fog for 150 years, that is already a remarkable ending. So in the end, Lincoln's family secret was not simply solved by modern science. It was measured, tested, reduced from legend to evidence, and that may be the most fascinating result of all. Not that DNA gave this story perfect closure, but that it showed exactly where closure becomes confidence, and exactly where confidence still has to stop.